Out of the top 250 highest grossing films last year, only 16% were directed by women. 16. Which Hollywood considers progress. Yet somehow, this is actually the best it's ever been. So how did we end up here? And is it actually getting better? Or are we just really bad at math? To try and figure this out, I picked up Helen O'Hara's excellent book, Women vs. Hollywood. It's a deep dive into women's roles in film from the silent era to today, packed with fascinating data and stories. Now I should say I'm just going to focus on Hollywood here, so no Bollywood, Nollywood or Swallywood. That last one, I made that one up. So why do we need more women to direct films? There's already plenty of men doing fine work, right? Sure, but here's the catch. If only one type of person gets to tell stories, what kind of world are we actually seeing on screen? Is it the full spectrum of human experience or just one narrow slice of life? So what we need in art is diversity. Diversity in gender, race, sexuality, and life experience. This is not just good in general to create a more equal work environment and industry, it's also important in what is being portrayed. If we only let one type of person make films, we only get a small selection of people with just a small amount of life experience to share from. Take the UK, for example, the country where I've been a resident in for over 10 years now. Here, around 51% of film directors went to private schools. Compare that with the general population where only 7% of people are privately educated. That means you get an industry where most storytellers grew up with similar backgrounds, similar privileges, and similar perspectives. But it's not just that. What happens when you diversify in the field of directors and producers? Well, the other jobs in the industry also get diversified. When you put women in roles of directors, the amount of women writers move up to 59% compared to only 13% when men direct. And it's even much worse when you just factor in black women, because then the number is down at 2% when men direct. And that's just the beginning. For the few films that are actually being directed by women, they usually have much smaller budgets and get bought by smaller distribution companies. So even though the films get made, and sure, they're called feature films, but there is a world of difference between a $200 million Nolan blockbuster and a $2 million period drama by Kelly Reichardt. The stories are made, yes, but with a fraction of the resources, reach, and impact. And it's not just budgets. Women often face massive gaps between projects, even after proving successful. Take Patty Jenkins. Her debut film was the critically acclaimed hit Monster, that won a ton of awards and was also a huge box office hit compared to its budget. And even though all that, she didn't make another film until 2017. So 14 years later. That's not a reflection of skill or ambition, it's about access. And that's just one story. There's dozens more like it. But how did this happen? How did we even end up here? Where did it even start? For that, we need to go back, way back, to the very beginning. Back in the early days of cinema, women played a huge role. Pioneers like Alice Guy Blaché, often considered the first person ever to direct a narrative film, were shaping the medium in the late 1800s. Then there was Lois Weber, one of the most prolific directors of the 1910s. She directed films about abortion, poverty, and capital punishment, subjects considered far too controversial for the time. In fact, in 1916, she was also Universal's highest paid director. But there was something that happened slightly after that. Studios became bigger, budgets ballooned, and suddenly women were pushed out of directing. If you look at the years between the 1940s and 1970s, during these roughly 30 years, there were only 14 films directed by women and distributed by the major studios. During the golden years of the studio system, 14 films in 30 years. And these 14 films were made by just 7 women. That's an insane number. But how does it look now? What's changed in the last 50 years? Let's say from that time when there were 14 films directed by women in 30 years. Well, a lot has changed. You might think we've finally hit equality, that women now direct half of the films, but no, it's not even close. The reality is far less exciting. What has actually happened is not as much as you might like. If you look at the top 250 highest grossing films in the US in 2024, as I mentioned in the beginning, around 16% were directed by women according to the Celluloid Ceiling study. That number was the same in 2023 as well. However, if you look at a smaller sample, let's say the top 100 films, then it's only 11% that were directed by women. It's hard to find numbers from every year, but we can still see the progression here in this chart. From 1990, when around only 5% of the films were directed by women, to 9% in 1998. So the 90s almost doubled the amount of women directors. But if you look closely, what happened after that? Well, you then have an almost flat line for the next 20 years, from 1998 to 2020, when it suddenly jumped to 18%, followed by 17% in 2021, and now seem to have stabilized around 16%. So what led to this jump in 2020? Well, after the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement broke through in 2017 and 2018, this did lead to some in the industry looking over hiring practices, and the big film festivals also started to give a bigger spotlight to women directors, which then led to bigger distribution deals as well. So that definitely led to some change, but as we all remember, 2020 and 2021 were the pandemic years, and a lot of studios put their big films on hold for a year or two until we could go back to normal. And this made room for more lower and mid-budget films directed by women, so it wasn't just that Hollywood all of a sudden started hiring women to direct films. Now, to test my own bias, because I definitely watch a lot more films directed by men than by women, I took a look at my Letterboxd account for 2024 and also narrowed it down to films that were made in the 2020s, just so we set up parameters that are somewhat comparable with today's film releases, and I'm not happy about the results. In the year 2024, I watched 329 films. 193 of those were made in the 2020s. And out of those films, 44 were directed by women. This comes to 22.8%, so almost a quarter of the newer films I watched were directed by women. Slightly better than the amount of films directed by women overall. However, something that's important to notice with my list is also that out of these 44 films, it was heavily slanted towards documentary films and independent films. So 2 types of films that generally have a higher percentage of women directing them. But hey, this was never going to be a perfect comparison. And there is also one other thing I would like to unfortunately point out. There were several of the 44 films that were co-directed, so both had a male and female director. But what I also want to add is that it is also up to us, the consumers, to watch films outside of what's the most easily accessible. And to be fair, most casual film watchers have no idea who directed the film they're watching, unless it's one of the big ones like Tarantino or Scorsese. So we have to seek out these films that might not be the first thing that pops up on the streaming service homepage or is shown at the local multiplex. So what does all of this mean for the future? I mean, it's complicated. On the one hand, we have an all-time high of women directors in the spotlight with Ava DuVernay, Emerald Fennell, Greta Gerwig, and Chloe Zhao that are creating great films, both critically acclaimed but also box office hits, with some films passing $1 billion at the worldwide box office. The question is, are these outliers or the beginning of a trend? This does make me think that the percentage of women helming more films in the top 250 will go up. And if we ever even reach 30% of Hollywood movies being directed by women, what are those films going to be? Will it be the bottom 30% when it comes to budget, or will it even out, having more big budget films made by women? Who knows? Progress is extremely slow. But there is some room for cautious optimism. Streaming services are a great market for women filmmakers internationally, and with younger audiences caring more about diversity both in front of the camera and behind the camera, I think we're moving in the right direction, and it will make the studio bosses not be able to close their eyes to this progress any longer, I hope. But how does it look in other countries? In my own home country of Sweden, the Swedish Film Institute released a report that says that yearly their aim is to fund projects 50-50 for men and women. 50% of the funding going to men and 50% of the funding going to women. And in a country with very few feature films being funded every year, the numbers can vary a lot from year to year. In 2024, it was 32% of the films that were directed by women. But the year before it was 57%, which is just incredible. But to note, the highest budget film directed by a woman in Sweden ever is Pleasure from 2021, that had a production budget of, hold on to your seats, a whopping 19 million Swedish kronor. Which might sound like a lot, but is the equivalent of 1.8 million US dollars, which in the US would count as a low budget indie pretty much. So it's not that the gender parity in Sweden makes it possible for Swedish women to make $100 million Netflix movies or even $10 million ones. But after all of this, I thought I'd share some of my favorite movies directed by women. I especially want to recommend Falcon Lake and The Novice. Falcon Lake is directed by Charlotte Le Bon, which you might remember from the third season of White Lotus, where she plays Chloe. This is a beautiful coming-of-age film with a touching story and some of the most gorgeous cinematography I've ever seen. This is the ultimate sad summer coming-of-age film. And The Novice is just an incredible high-tension sports film where we follow a student that gets on the rowing team and she starts pushing herself harder and harder and starts spiraling. No more spoilers. Anyway, I would love to know some of your favorite films directed by women. Leave them down below in the comments, and that's it from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.